And the winner of the 16-bit console generation is... Well, you have to watch the video to find out. I'm going to decide what my 16-bit winner is in this video. I'm going to compare them in different categories and pick a winner for each one, and then in the end, the overall winner. Remember, this is my opinion, and it might differ from yours, and that's fine. Overall, there wasn't a loser in the 16-bit era. Maybe. Maybe there were. We'll see. Roll the cinematic. It was 1987 when NEC kicked off the 16-bit battle in Japan with its NES competitor PC Engine. Suppose you want to consider PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16, as it was known in the West, as a 16-bit system. That's up to you. I'm not saying it isn't, but it sure has way more similarities with the NES than its 16-bit rivals, the Sega Mega Drive/Genesis or Super Nintendo Entertainment System. A year later, Sega released their 16-bit system, the Mega Drive, in Japan, and in 1989, less than a year later in North America, and properly started battling Nintendo's 8-bit juggernaut, the NES. PAL regions got theirs a year later in 1990. NEC released the TurboGrafx 16 2 weeks after Sega released the Genesis in North America. This made NEC's offering basically dead on arrival. According to Wikipedia, it was discontinued in 1994. If that's true or not, I don't know, but in practice, it was over for Turbo in the West long before that, and wasn't even released in PAL regions at all, excluding a couple of test markets briefly in Europe. They didn't even release the mini version in PAL regions, probably because nobody has any nostalgia for it in Europe or other PAL regions. Or so I thought, but apparently it was, at least in some countries, as PC Engine Core Graphics Mini. Maybe in those same couple countries that tested the original back in the day. I sure haven't seen one sold anywhere in Finland. Amazon UK is selling it at least, UK being one of those test markets back then, along with Spain and France, based on what I could find quickly online. Anyway, this video is about the 16-bit war between Sega and Nintendo, so that means I will ignore the Turbo from now on. I just wanted to mention it to avoid comments about ignoring it. Nintendo finally brought the fresh troops into battle with the Super Nintendo in 1990 in Japan and 1991 in North America. PAL releases would be in 1992 in Europe and 1993 in some other PAL regions. Yeah, things were rough in PAL regions back then. 1993! The PlayStation was only a year away in Japan when some places finally got the Super Nintendo. Let's briefly discuss the boring technical specifications for both systems before moving on to more interesting topics, such as the games themselves. Before I get to it, I just want to say that even though I have some basic understanding of this stuff, I am not an expert, and I might get some things wrong. If I do, you will let me know in the comments. Some interesting key differences define Mega Drive and Super Nintendo, and how the games look and feel on both systems. The Sega Mega Drive/Genesis has the blast processing.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
And no, it's not some weird thing deep inside the system that developers allegedly knew existed, as one Digital Foundry video from a few years ago suggested, or at least that wasn't what the marketing was all about. It was all about the Mega Drive's faster CPU. The Motorola 68000 was clocked at 7.67 MHz in NTSC regions and 7.6 MHz in PAL regions, while the SNES CPU Rigo 5822 was clocked at 3.57 MHz in NTSC regions and 3.54 MHz in PAL regions. Needless to say, the Mega Drive has faster processor. In its heyday, the Mega Drive had 64 KB of work RAM, 64 KB of VRAM, and 8 KB of sound memory, plus the ROM cartridge for games up to 4 MB or 32 MB. Later, Pierre Solar utilized 64 MB or an 8 MB cartridge. On the other hand, the Super Nintendo has 128 KB of work RAM, double that of the Mega Drive. However, it only has an 8-bit memory bus, while Mega Drive has 16-bit memory bus. This makes Mega Drive memory access faster, with the memory bandwidth of 10 MB per second compared to Super Nintendo's 2.7 MB per second. Is Super Nintendo even really a 16-bit system? Yes, kind of the same way as PC Engine is. Super Nintendo also has 64 KB of sound RAM and is purely limited to that, while Mega Drive's 8 KB in comparison sounds like puny amount. However, it can also address work RAM and even cartridge ROM for sound. Yes, up to 8 MB with modern cards. Of course, you'd have nothing but sound, but it would be technically possible. Super Nintendo has 64 KB of VRAM, which is the same amount as Mega Drive. However, again, it is a bit slower than Mega Drive's 13.4 MB per second bandwidth against 11.16 MB per second on Super Nintendo. Super Nintendo's maximum cartridge ROM size was 6 MB or 48 MB. It's a little bit larger than Mega Drive's in its heyday at 4 MB, but again, the Mega Drive could read from it almost 4 times faster. Mega Drive/Genesis was all about that fast processing after all. Mega Drive's color palette is 512 colors total, and it could display 61 to 64 colors at once on the screen, without any shadow and highlight tricks. When utilizing those techniques, the total effective color palette is 1536 and 183 to 192 effective colors on a screen at once. After taking a heavy beating earlier this round, Super Nintendo will win the colors round hands down. There is a palette of 32,768 colors to choose from and 256 colors on screen simultaneously, or 121 to 256 depending on the background mode. Yeah, Mode 7 is one of those. And you can really tell, SNES games appear way more colorful, especially when compared side by side with the games that are on both systems. Super Nintendo always has more color. Both systems support multiple resolutions, but the typical resolution in NTSC regions for the Mega Drive games is 320 by 224 pixels, and for the Super Nintendo it is 256 by 224 pixels. That's why many Super Nintendo games appear wider or have a letterboxed presentation compared to the Mega Drive, which usually does not. I don't fill the screen with the gameplay footage in this video, so you can clearly see how, in many cases, Super Nintendo games had a lower resolution than Mega Drive games. It's another win for the Mega Drive, but Super Nintendo strikes back with its sprite capabilities. While the Mega Drive can have 80 8x8 to 32x32 sprites on screen simultaneously, the Super Nintendo can do 128 8x8 to 16x16 or 32 32x32 sprites on screen simultaneously. While the Mega Drive supports 2 scrolling background planes, the Super Nintendo can do 1 to 4 background planes. And let's not forget that famous background mode 7 and sprite scaling capabilities on Super Nintendo. Last but not least, the sound. Mega Drive has Zilog C80 driving the sound and providing backward compatibility with Master System and Yamaha YM2612 and Sega PSC sound chips for Mega Drive sound and Master System sound compatibility respectively. Mega Drive sound is typical FM synthesis, but its YM2612 supports PCM sampling. The Super Nintendo is all about PCM sampling with its Sony SCP-700 audio CPU and Sony SDSP sound chip designed by the father of the PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi. In comparison, Super Nintendo has more orchestral sounds and lots of reverb. It fits some games better than the Mega Drive's FM synthesis, but that's not always the case. For example, Donkey Kong Country. And Star Fox, known as Star Wing in PAL regions, has amazing themes on SNES. But Streets of Rage 1 and 2 have nothing but fantastic music from start to finish. They are very different, but awesome. Before we get to the games, we need to talk about another essential part of any gaming experience, the controllers. Today, controllers are very standardized and every manufacturer has pretty much the same layout and the exact same number of buttons on them. But back then, they could be very different, and in this case, they couldn't be more different. Which one you prefer? The SNES or Mega Drive controller is very subjective, but there are very objective differences as well, especially when it comes to fighting games on these systems. So, because fighting games reveal the most significant difference between them, let's dive into some Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, shall we? The elephant in the room is the fact that the Mega Drive controller has only 3 face buttons, 4 if you count the start button. That's the same amount that Nintendo's last generation machine had, albeit the Mega Drive's C button is a bit more useful in action games than the select button on the NES controller. Fight! There are 5 actions in Mortal Kombat 2. Low punch, high punch, low kick, high kick and block. On the Mega Drive, the start button serves as a block, and the A button is shared between low and high punch. Not ideal. Street Fighter 2 has 6 actions, 3 punches and 3 kicks. So, 4 buttons are even less ideal than in MK2. The start button switches between punches and kicks. Some people claim they can play SF2 like that, but I'd say no. Just no. Of course, a 6-button controller is available for Mega Drive and Genesis to solve this problem, but that was a separate purchase. On SNES, on the other hand, there are 4 face buttons, 2 shoulder buttons, and start and select. That's 8 buttons! It has twice as many buttons as the standard Mega Drive controller. And of course, it works perfectly with Mortal Kombat games and Street Fighter 2 if you are willing to use shoulder buttons for one of the punches and kicks, just like you would on a modern console with a modern controller. I have to give this round to Super Nintendo for having a real innovation with the controller and having enough buttons for arcade fighting games of the era, even if it wasn't the 6-button layout from the arcade cabinet like the Mega Drive 6-button controller is. Even Mortal Kombat arcade games didn't have that 6-button layout. They had 4 buttons for attacks, a block button in the middle, and later a run button for use with your thumb. I feel more at home with the SNES controller because that's the layout I've been used to playing these games with for decades now. Unlike 6 face button layout on the Mega Drive, separate purchase one. The Super Nintendo controller resembles the PlayStation controllers I'm so used to, so it's just better in my opinion. Anything other than the now standard diamond pattern on face buttons and shoulder buttons just feels weird. I have to say though that the D-pad is way better on the Mega Drive than on any Nintendo controller. Even though it was a revolutionary design with the NES back then, I think it's the worst D-pad. Only after Xbox D-pads. especially the one on the Xbox 360 controller. Sega had the best D-pad before the horrible Dreamcast controller. PlayStation D-pads have always been passable and peaked on DualShock 4, almost better than these Sega controllers. The standard 3-button Mega Drive/Genesis pad is perfectly fine for most games on the system. I just wanted to make that clear. Let's take a look at some of my favorite games on both systems. And even some that I'm not that familiar with. Again, these are my favorite games and I probably won't mention half of yours. But let everybody know your favorites in the comments. As you probably guessed from the controller part of the video, fighting games are among my favorites for these systems. But which system had better versions of these fighting games besides controller differences? Let's assume you have found a controller solution for each system that doesn't prevent you from enjoying these games. Who got it better? Super Nintendo got an exclusive port of the original Street Fighter II, The World Warrior. So if this is the game you want to play on your 16-bit video game console, the SNES is where it's at. But Mega Drive had a year later Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition that also includes the turbo version. And yes, turbo speed it is indeed if you crank it up. SF2 Turbo is also on Super Nintendo, but the maximum speed is nowhere near the game's Mega Drive and Genesis versions. That's the blast processing for you. Of course, it's starting to be unplayable on those speeds. I'd give this round before Super Street Fighter 2 for the Mega Drive. It simply plays better, in my opinion, and in some ways even looks better, less colorful of course. Music and sound effects are fine on both systems. Super Street Fighter 2 is another story though. If Super is what you want to play on your 16-bit console, you are better off with the Super Nintendo. But damn, it's slow. When I played these back to back coming from that Mega Drive hyper fighting at max speed. However, you can speed it up a bit on both systems. They somehow made Mega Drive games sound way worse in this release. They probably gave the sound way less memory because, admittedly, Super on Sega's system is more colorful and better graphically than the Special Champion Edition was. This is the one I played on the Mega Drive in my friend's house back in the day. Of course I thought it was fine. I couldn't compare it to anything back then, except for Mortal Kombat 2, which I had at home, which I heavily preferred back then. Yeah, I was more of an MK guy. Nowadays I think I like Capcom fighters more. Super plays fine on Mega Drive. It even looks fine, but damn it sounds awful.
Round 3, fight!
And then there is Street Fighter Alpha 2, the so-called impossible port of Capcom's CPS2 game on Super Nintendo. It looks, sounds and plays fine, but it sure has to stop loading constantly between almost everything and infamously after a fight in every round. Still, it's a great addition to the SNES fighting game library. Some community-made versions fix many things and offer what could have been, but I wanted to keep this video to officially released games from when these systems were commercially relevant. There are 4 Mortal Kombat games on both systems, MK1, 2, 3 and Ultimate 3. The first Mortal Kombat game infamously toned down the violence on the Super Nintendo and didn't feature the gore and blood showers of the arcade game. However, this is all intact on the Mega Drive after inputting a code during the attract screen. Unlike the Super Nintendo, the Mega Drive has those too. Super Nintendo also plays worse, way worse. The controls are stiff and unresponsive, laggy if you will. on the Nintendo system. I think the Mega Drive even sounds better, mainly because of the music. However, the speech samples are better on the Super Nintendo, and the Mega Drive is missing a few of them. All the things I mentioned apply to MK2 as well. The only difference this time is that Super Nintendo players also got all the blood and gore. MK2 on the Mega Drive gets lots of shit, but I think it's the best playing version of the game. Yes, even better than the arcade game. It has more responsive controls, while the SNES again has stiff and laggy controls, and very low resolution, but it's more colorful than the Mega Drive, as expected.
Superb. Kitana wins.
The original Mortal Kombat 3 is on both systems, and it's ridiculously hard on both systems, even at the easiest difficulty. I couldn't beat the first guy, or girl in this case, on Super Nintendo. I admit I am not any good at it, but the first opponent on easiest difficulty should be beatable by the people who suck at it. Wouldn't you agree? I could beat the first 2 or 3 on Mega Drive. That alone makes it a better game. It also sounds better and plays better because, once again, SNES has more laggy controls. There are more speech samples on the Mega Drive compared to the first 2 games, but some stages are missing, probably from both versions of MK3 on 16-bit consoles. Don't quote me on that though. And then there's the Ultimate MK3, or just UMK3. It's also on both systems. This time though, it's starting to be too much for poor old Mega Drive, which I feel is even less colorful and monochromatic than any previous ones. Also, it has many speech samples missing again, but so does the Super Nintendo version of UMK3. UMK3 is better on Super Nintendo because it's more recognizable as UMK3 and finally doesn't have laggy controls, or at least not as laggy as all the previous MK games on the system. This makes it more playable, unlike all the others. Also, I could beat the first few opponents on this one on Super Nintendo. I had a better time on SNES with this one. I think both are missing some stages. I didn't check which ones and how many are in each version. The conclusion is that Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 started to be out of these poor old systems league. There is Killer Instinct on Super Nintendo, a port of Rare's 1994 arcade game. It's mostly there and very playable, but all the obvious cuts for the time had to be made. I have no clue how to play this one properly either, but if you do and want to play it on your 16-bit machine, the Super Nintendo has it. Super Nintendo also has this obscure fighting game, a hidden gem, Taekwondo, which was only released in Japan and South Korea. It has been one of my favorite SNES games since I first played on an emulator with my brother in the late 1990s. Good game, good memories, highly recommended. There are also other fighting games on these systems, such as the Fatal Fury games on both consoles. However, I don't think those early SNK games were that good at that point, especially these console versions, but they are there if you want to check them out. Overall, I'm calling fighting games a draw. Street Fighter and MK games generally play better on the Mega Drive, but the SNES has Killer Instinct and Taekwondo, which elevate the Super Nintendo to make it a draw for me. I like racing games, arcade, more simulation types, vehicular combat and futuristic games like Wipeout. The problem with 16-bit racing games and earlier is their technical limitations. I've said numerous times on the channel before that racing games really only became good after polygonal 3D graphics. And in console space, this means 5th generation, like PlayStation. Now that I have recently played some of these 16-bit racing games again, I realized that racing games before the 32-bit console generation were missing more than just 3D graphics. The sound. The engine notes are non-existent to horrible and not like a real car or whatever you are driving, if the game has engine sounds at all. On systems like PlayStation, cars sounded more or less like cars in games like Gran Turismo. I don't care too much about this genre on anything older than 5th generation consoles, but here are a few worth mentioning on both systems. Mega Drive has the latter two Lotus games. Lotus Turbo Challenge 2, also known as Lotus Turbo Challenge on Mega Drive, and Lotus 3, the Ultimate Challenge, also confusingly known as Lotus 2 Rex or just Lotus 2 on Mega Drive. I hate that they did this a lot back then. I was genuinely confused when I was researching and playing them for this video because I was only familiar with the Amiga games that were named correctly. So, the first Lotus game wasn't on the Mega Drive or the Genesis. They aren't anything special, but they are nostalgic to me, because I played them a lot, especially the second one on the Amiga. I don't think there are too many differences between the Amiga and Mega Drive versions, except that music is way better on the Amiga. Speaking of music, the first, I mean the second game, has none during the races, but the Lotus theme sounds decent. The second game, I mean the third game, lets you choose between car sounds and music during the races using the car stereo system. Yes, you can't have both at the same time. Wouldn't that be nice? Super Nintendo has Top Gear games instead. The second one is also on the Mega Drive. The Super Nintendo game is superior in every way. The Mega Drive game is way easier though. I won this race on my first try. The Top Gear games are similar to Lotus games, in some ways better and in some ways worse. The first Top Gear game is a split-screen presentation even if you play alone. That's always fun, with the most sarcastic voice I can muster. But hallelujah, they have music and engine sounds simultaneously during the races, except for the Top Gear 2 on Mega Drive, where you have to choose between music and engine sounds. That's the real superpower of the Super Nintendo if you ask me. Mega Drive has another good racing game series, Super Nintendo doesn't, Road Rash. This is Electronic Arts beloved motorbike combat racing game series. The first three games are on the Mega Drive and Genesis. The first two games were released in 1991 and 1992 respectively, and the third game was released 3 years later in 1995, a very late release for the Mega Drive. This was after Amazing 32-bit Road Rash, which utilized digitized graphics, was released. So what did they do? The same thing on Mega Drive, and the very limited color palette doesn't do it any favors. It can look a bit more tolerable on small CRT TV though, and I think it's the best playing of the three. It also has the best music of the bunch, composed by Don Vega. Instead of Rob Hubbard, who composed the music for the first two games. Yes, the same Rob Hubbard who made this. I guess everything he did wasn't good because the music in the first two Road Rash games on the Mega Drive isn't the best. The music in the second game is especially horrible. still can't have engine sounds and music simultaneously. The first game has only music during the races, and the latter two lets you choose. And I tell you, you don't want to select engine noises only. At least the music of the two choices is more pleasant to listen to, and quite good in the third game. This is an excellent trilogy of racing games that Mega Drive has, but Super Nintendo doesn't. Super Nintendo on the other hand had Kawasaki games. They are not quite the same thing as road rash, but you are driving motorbikes. Kawasaki motorbikes. The first game, Kawasaki Caribbean Challenge, features motorcycles and jet skis, but is a top-down game, so I counted it out immediately. I tried it out anyway, and yes, it's rubbish. The jet skis part is slightly better than the motorbike part, but not really. The water looks nice, and it's a bit more fun to play because the path you can take is way wider. This means you can make bigger and more mistakes and get punished less. Ultimately, this only makes me want to play Wave Race 64 instead. I made a whole video about it. Links are in the description. First, watch this one until the end. Also, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel for more content like this and gave this one a thumbs up if you enjoyed watching it. Thank you. The second one, Kawasaki Superbike Challenge, is way more impressive and has even some polygons. After playing it a bit though, I don't think it's very good game either. It's light years better racing game than the first one, but I still wouldn't bother playing it over road rash games on the Mega Drive, unless you want a more realistic motorcycle motorsport experience on your 16-bit console. Real life brands in the game definitely gives it that vibe. Micro Machines is a series of top-down racing games in which micro-sized vehicles race on kitchen tables, etc. It has its charm, for sure. I never liked this type of racing games with a top-down or isometric view. This is mainly because you can't see ahead very much, which is kind of important when driving. So, because of that, track memorization is even more important than in racing, where you can see more than a few centimeters ahead. The first two games are on both Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. They look and play pretty much the same, but neither has music during the races. The biggest difference is difficulty. The Mega Drive games are pretty challenging, but the SNES games are super easy. I won the first 3 head-to-head races under 1 lap in the first game on Super Nintendo. I wouldn't play these games on either system these days, but if you want to and want a challenge, play the Mega Drive games. If you just want an easy win, the Super Nintendo gives you that. Both consoles have various Formula 1 games with varying quality. I'm not going to deep dive into those in this video. If F1 racing is your thing, both systems probably have a game for you. Then we have hard driving on Mega Drive and race driving on both. Yeah, polygons on Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. On Super Nintendo we have Stunt Race FX, which utilizes the cheat chip inside the cartridge called Super FX. Okay, Mega Drive has one of those too. Virtua Racing is powered by Sega's SVP chip inside the cartridge. They don't look too hot, even though Virtua Racing is fun to play in short spurts. Stunt Race FX is pretty fun too, but if I had to choose, I'd choose Virtua Racing every time. This is not what I mean by saying polygons made racing games good though. I mean this. After playing all that, I must give the Mega Drive/Genesis the racing category. It has more and better racing games, better simulations, motorcycles or polygonal. Having Lotus and Road Rash seals the deal for me. After those 3D racing games on these systems, why not take a look at those other 3D games on each system? The most famous 3D game on Super Nintendo is Star Fox, Star Wing in Ball Lands. Or is it Doom? Either way, they are both on Super Nintendo. Star Fox 2 was never released during the Super Nintendo's commercially relevant life, but it was included with SNES Classic in 2017, so I guess it's an officially released game now. There are many more Super FX games. This episode isn't about 3D games, I just wanted to mention a few more notable ones on each system. But what about the Mega Drive? What does it have to offer in 3D? Considering the only game that utilized the SPP chip, Sega's answer to FX chip, was Virtual Racing. Some games on the Mega Drive and Genesis have some 3D elements put into them, even though the main game wasn't about 3D graphics, like in that Super Nintendo Kawasaki motorcycle game earlier in this video. For example, Muhammad Ali Heavyweight Boxing by version has a 3D ring and an intro. Then there are all the primitive fight simulation games, sports games, mainly golf games with a 3D pitch, etc. We skip all that. And we'll finish this section with an impressive little game called Red Zone by Syrinx. Yeah, it's more like a tech demo than an actual game, but it's still impressive. It was an officially released commercial game for the Mega Drive and Genesis after all. Even though Virtual Racing is the game I'd play the most out of these, I'll give this round to Super Nintendo for having more than one game that utilizes the Super FX chip, which makes 3D graphics possible on the system. And it has Doom, the best game of the bunch by far. Of course, the SNES version isn't the version I'd play if I wanted to play Doom today, but if that was the only version that suddenly existed, you could still play Doom. I'm not a big RPG guy these days. Back in the day for sure. That's why I'm not going to spend too much time on this genre. Both systems have them, but I think Super Nintendo has more of them, and they are really good ones, like Final Fantasy VI, also known as Final Fantasy III in the West, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, Super Mario RPG, etc. The Mega Drive had Phantasy Star and Shining Force games. Yeah, as I said, I am not an RPG guy anymore. I don't know. I want to mention a few miscellaneous action games I feel nostalgic about or have just been playing on these consoles. Alien 3 is one of those games on both systems. Interestingly enough, they are quite different games even though they look similar. The Super Nintendo version offers more cinematic and deeper gameplay with selectable missions, while the Mega Drive offers a more linear experience with a time limit. Mega Drive game also looks and sounds better. At least it's more nostalgic to me because it's one of those games I remember playing as a kid when our neighbors used to rent it often. Why didn't they just buy the game? Anyway, it's nothing amazing, but it's worth playing on both systems. I prefer the more straightforward Mega Drive game. True Lies is probably my all-time favorite movie. At least one of the best movies ever made. So I have to like the game, do I? Actually, it's pretty fun game. It's also on both systems, and at least based on my limited testing, it's almost identical on both systems. Naturally, the Super Nintendo might be more colorful, and the controller is better suited for it. It's very natural to switch weapons with the L and R shoulder buttons. I like how Albert lectures you when you unleash innocent bystanders. Of course, this will be a common occurrence in video games in years to come, but it's wild on video game consoles from the era when they were widely considered kids' toys. The characters' interactions really capture the feeling of the movie. I will definitely play this one more at some point. Oh yeah, point for Super Nintendo. Both systems have a fantastic Castlevania game. I think Super Nintendo gets a slight edge with Super Castlevania 4 over Mega Drive's Castlevania Bloodlines, known as Castlevania the New Generation in PAL regions. Still, if you call yourself a Castlevania fan, you must play both. Heard that? You must play both. Let's mention sports games at this point as well. Don't click off yet, this will be over quickly. Both systems have them, EA Sports stuff is on both consoles. If you want sports, either system will do, but I'll give the sports category to Mega Drive just because it has more of it. And in some critical cases like EA's Madden, FIFA and NHL, it is better there. Okay, let's take a look at platformers. You thought I wouldn't talk about platformers, didn't you? Well, I kinda have to. They are still generation-defining games during the 16-bit era, and I wouldn't hear the end of it if I didn't mention them. When I first got to play Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo, shortly after its release, it was a mind-blowing experience. This is the best 16-bit platformer. Everything about it just clicks perfectly. Graphics, while pre-rendered, still look nice even today, controls are responsive, and it's mostly your fault when you fail. Mostly. The game can have cheap deaths with stuff that gets you that you didn't see coming. Sounds and music are fantastic, as I mentioned earlier in this video. The sequel, Donkey Kong Country Diddy's Kong Quest, where you play as Diddy Kong alongside Donkey Kong, is a fine game too. So if you don't like having someone following you all the time, you don't like it here. I don't care too much about that. I can concentrate on the character I'm playing. Third game, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, is more of the same. This time you play as Dixie Kong, followed by a giant infant Kiddy Kong. This is the weakest of the three, but still a quality game. They're all decent enough games. But nothing can top this first Donkey Kong Country game. Vector Man was apparently Sega's answer to Donkey Kong Country, having pre-rendered graphics and all that. Technically impressive game, reminds me more of a demo scene than a video game from the era. No wonder, because that's exactly what it originally was, according to Wikipedia. A 3D tech demo by tools programmer Carl Robillard, inspired by vector ball demos for the Amiga. This options menu is barely legible, and after making your changes you have to watch the intro again. which is maybe even little too much like a tech demo for its own good. I'm so lame that I play at lame difficulty. I think this game is pretty lame. There's barely any color. Mega Drive can put way more colorful presentation on the screen. Look at this other platformer you probably never heard about. Vectorman reminds me of that ugly CGA color palette on 1980s DOS PCs. There may be a decent game underneath if you tolerate the CGA color palette and the difficulty. I couldn't even finish the first stage on lame difficulty. Admittedly, I didn't try very hard. At least in Donkey Kong Country and that other platformer I just showed you, I could easily beat the first level. Good game design has a proper difficulty ramp. What about Vectorman 2? It has to be better, right? Yeah, kind of. I still wouldn't call it a great game though. First, they learned their lesson with too fancy effects in the menus. I'm still lame, so lame it is for me. The game is still too hard for it's so good anyway. I tolerated this game a little longer than the first, but I still couldn't finish the first level unless you count that fall from the space as the first level. The level design and color palette is better than in the first game, but why is this first level so dark? I couldn't see where I was going, and it's just a maze with invisible holes on the ground. You might think I didn't give Vectorman games a fair shake, and maybe that's true, but if they infuriate me from the get-go, I won't tolerate them for a long time when I have so many more enjoyable games to play. If I wanted to enjoy a 16-bit 2D platformer, Vectorman ain't it. If I had to choose between Vectorman and Donkey Kong Country and could never play another one again, it would be an easy choice. It would be an easy choice between Vectorman and that other platformer you have never heard about. Yeah, let's talk about that other platformer you have never heard about. Sega's 16-bit answer in the early 90s to Mario on Nintendo was, of course, Sonic the Hedgehog, which elevated Mega Drive and Genesis as platform to new heights. Now it was truly a mainstream game system, and it gave Nintendo a run for its money before Sony destroyed them with the PlayStation only a few short years later. Poor Nintendo can't get a break. There were 3 numbered games on the Mega Drive, all decent games. I usually only play the first level of the first 2 games until I get bored. I like fast moving stuff, and the first level is the only level that allows this. The third game's first level is already way slower and more complicated. That can be good if you want your platformers to be more maze-like. You probably would love the Vectorman 2 I talked about a couple of minutes ago. I don't care much about Sonic games these days, or platformers as genre, if you couldn't tell. Sure, we have to mention Mario, I guess. Super Mario World was a launch game for the Super Nintendo and is probably the best Mario game ever made, or at least one of the best. Mario 64 blew my mind so hard back in the day that it's my favorite, as I said in my Why Old Games Were Better video. If you haven't seen it, there's a link in the description. Yeah, Mario World is the only SNES Mario game I need, and I'd play this over any Sonic game. The sequel, Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, while technically impressive and utilizing the Super FX2 chip, is kind of an infuriating game. I don't want to babysit Mario, I want to play as Mario. Then there is probably one of the earliest examples of a remaster or a remake on consoles. Super Mario All-Stars collects the Mario games from the NES and gives them a 16-bit makeover. It even has the last levels, the real Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan. It's a good value package, but if I wanted to play these, I'd play the original games on the NES instead. Having Super Mario World and especially Donkey Kong Country secures the Super Nintendo a win for the platformers. Of course, there are many more 2D side-scrolling platformers on both systems, but as I said earlier, platformers aren't too much of my cup of tea these days, so I can't be bothered to explore them more. At least not in this video, that is getting a bit long anyway. Last but not least, one of my favorite genres, the beat 'em ups, belt scrollers, brawlers, or even some sort of fighting, whatever you want to call them. Both systems have a few good ones. Let's start with the Super Nintendo and Final Fight. Capcom's 1989 arcade classic Final Fight was ported to the Super Nintendo. Sadly, it's not a very impressive port. It's kind of stiff, even more so than the arcade game, which hasn't aged well either. It's single player only, which is a big deal in a beat 'em up. Even though I mostly play video games alone these days, once in a while I have a few beers with my brother and we play some video games. Guess which game we are never going to play? Yep, the first Final Fight on Super Nintendo. We have played the 2 sequels though. And the elephant in the room, the missing character, Kai. A couple of years later, Kai got his own game, Final Fight Kai, with just 3 places Cody with Kai. Hakkar is in both games. Neither has multiplayer. So Final Fight on SNES sucks. Fortunately, Capcom made 2 sequels exclusively for the Super Nintendo, Final Fight 2 and 3. Final Fight 2 is a huge improvement on the first game and the best of the 3 in my opinion. Maki alone makes it the best. She's the coolest character in the 3 games. And here she punches a hole in the wall. Nice. Let's see how Blaze does it. Wow. Which girl does it better? Technically, in some ways, the second game looks better than the third one. I don't know. Final Fight 3 is more of the same, with a new roster of characters of course. There are 4 characters to choose from. Remember, the first game struggled to have 3. They must have used some pathetically small card or something in the first game. Along with Hakkar, Kai, who was missing from the first edition of the first game, makes a comeback. Newcomers are Dean and Lucia. Lucia is the new girl power in the game. She will later appear in Street Fighter V Arcade Edition in the distant future of 2019. Final Fight games are a fun addition to the Super Nintendo library. That said, it can't beat the premier beat 'em up series on Mega Drive and Genesis, the Streets of Rage. Let's talk about it. Finally, we are here in the video talking about my favorite 16-bit games, the Streets of Rage games on the Mega Drive. This is an almost perfect series of games, as perfect as video games can be. I have to admit that the first game looks a bit rough these days, but it's still a fantastic beat 'em up game, and the soundtrack is golden throughout. It might not have as impressive looking character sprites as Final Fight on SNES, but it is a superior game in every other way. Streets of Rage 2, on the other hand, is a perfect game in my opinion. The graphics got a major overhaul, and now being a 16 mega power, just like Final Fight on SNES, it doesn't even lose graphics to it, or to any of the Final Fight sequels. This game also has a pure orgasmic soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro, just like the first game did. The third game in the series, Streets of Rage 3, is where things went slightly south. Don't get me wrong, it's still a fantastic beat 'em up game. better than any of the final fights. It plays even faster and has some improved animation, like this bat swing compared to the second game. It's just that they butchered the game's western versions royally by censorship and changing the whole story. They even changed the characters' sprite colors to be wrong for unknown reasons. To combat the North American rental market, they also made the game unnecessarily hard in the West. On top of that, our PAL version is 50Hz. The Japanese bare knuckle 3 is alright though. It is absolutely the version to play these days. Of course, Yuzo Koshira's experimental soundtrack this time divides opinions widely. Some of it's decent enough and some is kind of awful. It has sure grown on me over the years and I have learned to like it. Of course, it would have been great to have a third stellar soundtrack like the first two games, but sadly that was not the case. That's about it. Of course, there are lots of games on both systems I didn't mention here, so let us all know your favorites on these legendary 16-bit consoles in the comments. Boils down to which game I like to play the most. Fighting games play better on the Mega Drive, and I prefer Streets of Rage games over Final Fights. Even though Super Nintendo won some categories like platformers, I barely ever play those these days. Usually, when I play something on 16 bits, it's either a fighting game like Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter or beat 'em up like Streets of Rage 2, which is easily one of my all-time favorite games. Also, the Mega Drive did have some serious technical advantages. Having a much faster CPU was a real advantage back then, even marketing took notice. I like the Super Nintendo controller better, but Mega Drive controller is fine for the vast majority of the games on that system, and 6-button version does the rest. Or when using an emulator, I personally use DualShock 4 for everything anyway, unless I for some reason want to have an authentic controller, and that's not that often because I'm lazy. My DS4 is always connected wirelessly to my entertainment PC. Sound is very subjective. In some games having Super Nintendo's sample-based orchestral sound is nice, but I prefer the FM synthesis for the most games. The arcade version of these games had FM synth, so that's even more authentic in that sense when talking about arcade game home conversions. I promised in the title, thumbnail and beginning of the video that I would actually declare a winner in the end. So here we are. The winner of the 16-bit console generation is the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis, whichever is called for you. It's the same thing either way. If you have watched the whole video to this point, I greatly appreciate it and want to thank you. Let everyone know by saying I did it in the comments. Now, even though 16 bits were great, you want to know why PlayStation won me over the next generation. Click now to watch it. Bye.